Unfortunately, we live in an anti-black, white supremacist, capitalist country, so that any efforts, especially by subaltern people like African Americans, to take charge of their own economics, to create some economic democracy and some wealth on their own is frowned upon.
Yes.
Because basically white supremacists, right, are making money off of exploiting blacks, right? I don't think we can avoid that. So throughout the history between the mutual aid societies and the actual co-ops, right, blacks are trying to get out from under that exploitation, whether it's through job or whether it's through buying from businesses, buying supplies or whatever. And each time, right, you would think, oh, who cares if 5 blacks, opt out of the system and don't buy from the white grocery store. But the whites cared because 1, they lost money, but 2, they lost face. And if more people did it, they would be out of business. And then, they also couldn't stand the optics of blacks being able to do for themselves, because the whole white supremacist narrative is about how blacks can't, right? They can't make any decisions, they can't run anything, they don't know what they're doing, they have to be under white folks. So when blacks started doing this stuff and succeeding, the white folks not having it. So that, so the what I call the sabotage really runs the range of just, underpricing them underpricing the blacks so they have to go out of business, not letting the white banks lend them money, the railroads not taking their produce, so lower level sabotage, insurance companies not insuring, but then they also went as far as lynching, burning down the co-ops, lynching. In fact, I looked at some of the lynching data that somebody like Ida B. Wells put together, and she was one of the ones who actually said that most lynching was about economics, not about sex, right? That most of the men, most of the blacks were male business people who were making, who were landowners or business owners. She didn't actually say co-ops, but when I started looking at the co-op history, it's the same story. So to stop them from succeeding and from being a model for other people, they would hound them, and then they used sex. Even in the co-op, some of the co-op examples, they accused the black leaders, the black male leaders, of some kind of sexual thing as a way to justify it, but they're really trying to stop the co-op. They're trying to stop independent black economic activity. And so they would burn down the buildings, lynch people, hound people. So I have examples of even massacres. One of the reasons I decided collective courage was not just it takes courage to do alternative economics, but it also just took courage to be blacks people trying to assert economic justice. Du Bois's notion of a black co-op economy, what he said was, right, that capitalism just allows a few people to make it. Everybody else gets left behind. If we're worried about our race, our group, right, then we need a strategy like cooperative ownership, because there you have broad ownership, you don't have individual wealth, you have community wealth, broad ownership, you have everybody who has a similar experience with the economy, a similar experience of being exploited, can now take control, right? And for the benefit not just of themselves but of the whole community. So the African American mutual aid started pretty much on the boats. When we were dragged here forcibly in chains, we were helping each other, even though on the boats we were, the captors wouldn't even let people who spoke the same language or who were from the same community be chained together. So, I mean, that kind of mutual aid and camaraderie is really incredible when you think about it, because you had people who weren't from the same culture, they weren't from the same religion, they didn't even have the same language, but they still were helping figure out how to support each other, whether it was supporting a whole group to jump overboard, whether it was supporting a group to have a resurrection, or whether just surviving the trip over here. So from then, we had this sense, I think probably from the way that African cultures had also had a sense of mutuality and communalism, and then we practiced it wherever we could. Sometimes it was a communal garden, sometimes it was the whole Underground Railroad to move people out of slavery up into freedom. Sometimes it was actually people pooling money to buy each other's freedom when those opportunities came up. And so just all the different, and actually the first really official mutual aid societies were burial societies, which again is interesting because it's about culture again, right? So enslaved people, right, you don't even own your own bodies, so you and your family can't control your burial. But it was so important how you get buried that, again, that mutual aid, they would pool resources so they could bury people the way they felt they deserved to be buried. And then that grew into all kinds of other mutual health associations, widow and orphans protection, even up to mutual insurance companies came out of that movement, and co-ops themselves. 60% of the mutual aid societies were actually started and run by Black women. And so by the late 1700s, early 1800s, we have some cities, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Richmond, that actually 60 or 70% of the Black population were a member of at least one mutual aid. Black women were much more involved in leadership roles in the Black co-op movement than I found in other co-op movements. So Ella Jo Baker, most people know her from the NAACP and SNCC, because in the 50s and 60s, she was like one of our icons in the civil rights movement, and had met a guy named George Schuyler, and together they started the Young Negroes Cooperative League. And that group was young Blacks who were promoting cooperative economics. They said, you know, here we are in the 1930s, whatever that was, 70 years out of enslavement, and yet we're still enslaved economically. We need to figure out how to create economic justice, and they said they felt that co-ops were the way to do that. And so they started talking to people about co-ops, training people, helping groups start. They had a 5-year plan about starting small. You just get a buying club and create a grocery store co-op, and then do a credit union, and then have a local regional association. They had, within their first year of starting, they had a conference in Pittsburgh, 600 people in 1931, so the height of the Great Depression. 600 young Black people came together to talk about co-ops. And so there was clearly this recognition that we need something new, we need alternative strategies, we need to come together to discuss them and learn about them, and then we need ways to support each other in doing it. And that's what the Young Negroes Cooperative League was trying to do, all those pieces. The first legacy is they actually were able to create a bunch of co-op societies around the U.S. The things that Ella Baker learned in the co-op movement, I argue, is what made her such an icon for the civil rights movement, because in the civil rights movement, she really is one of our sheroes specifically about grassroots democratic leadership and development. So it was an outgrowth of the movement for back pay and pensions for ex-slaves, which is basically reparations, right? But they were couching it in labor terms, right? That we should have back pay, that we should have had pensions. And so there was a movement, it was a federal policy movement, but also, as you see in the name, there was a mutual aid society that also became this lobbying and political party arm to promote for these reparations. And so the mutual aid part actually lasted like 30 years. So again, I'm showing these connections, right, between mutual aid, women's activism, reparations, cooperativism, community wealth, all those things that, almost all these stories, they all come together in some way. Basically, the most well-known Black woman civil rights leader, the only woman on the podium at the March on Washington. In the 1960s, she was working with Fannie Lou Hamer in Mississippi, and they were using this pig bank program, which actually was used in international development. And that's a way that you give women a pregnant sow. She takes care of the sow, and when the sow has babies, and they usually have 2 babies, sometimes 3, the woman gets to keep one of the babies. The other baby goes to somebody else, and the sow goes back to somebody else, who then repeats the process. And what you do then is put a pig in everybody's backyard. Right. And what a pig in your backyard means is that you eventually can have meat almost for a year, but also you can get that pig if it's a female, you can impregnate that pig and have more pigs. But it's a way to give an asset. When blacks got free, and even before emancipation, right, some blacks got free. Either they bought their freedom or they ran away or whatever. There are examples of communal towns where blacks created towns where they just own the land together and farm together. So we already have, so that was even earlier than the farm co-ops that we know of now. Right. So there was all those different kind of iterations of how to work together, how to own together, how to get around the fact, right, that we don't, it's hard to own land and we don't own land. But certainly after emancipation, there was a growing movement, but it's also what, sorry, not also, the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union, which I mentioned, that was part of what they were doing by the 1880s. Their plan was, they had the credit exchanges because they wanted to make sure there was credit for fair mortgages to buy land and equipment so that you could farm. They were continuing the mutual aid, but now, you know, by the 1880s, the U.S. has laws that you can create co-ops, so they're trying to use the new laws that allow you to actually have a co-op, not just a mutual aid society, right? So they're buying land as a co-op, they're creating credit unions so that they have access to credit, they're doing stores so they can buy in bulk the supplies and the food that they need, because if you remember, under sharecropping, they're in debt peonage all the time, because not only do they not own the land and they owe all their crop back to the landlord, but they have to buy from the landlord's store, their seed, their food, etc. And so that keeps them in perpetual debt. So they're using the co-op and the credit unions to get them out of that debt, to give them more control over all that, and to help them either buy land or maintain the land that they have. And so you find there's a lot of smaller organizations that do that too, in addition to these national groups that I mentioned. The importance of education, we probably didn't talk about it enough. I actually found that 95% of the co-ops that I learned about how they started with a study group or some kind of education program. And so I really talk about how important that is. One, it's an organizing tool, right? To get people together, get everybody in the same room, communicating, talking about what the issues are and why co-ops can be a solution, and then what is a co-op and how to do a co-op. But that learning together also creates the camaraderie and the trust that's needed to persist, to keep the co-op going. Also, co-ops really need continuous education, so that starting out with a culture and philosophy of learning together is really important, because you need to keep that going, to keep the co-op going. So I do talk a lot about how important education is.